Today we're going to be talking about identity.
Okay.
And I know it's kind of a fun thing to talk about. You have some expertise in this area. In particular, I was really excited about the opportunity to chat with you about this, given not only your expertise in the area, also your work in Mexico, and your work for the university on Aztec culture.
Okay.
So I just want to kind of have a little chat about that, and maybe we can talk about something that'll give our students some food for thought, something to pique their interest, and something to build on when we really dive into the psychology of identity development.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give a disclaimer.
Okay.
So, as a political anthropologist, what I basically look at when I think about identity are issues of power, and how identity becomes something that we invoke, that we develop because we seek to re-empower ourselves in one way or the other. And so, also another disclaimer, I wasn't born in Chicanx, so I was born in Mexicana and a girl child in the Perez family. But I didn't grow up in the U.S., I grew up in the Arab world in Europe. And so it wasn't until I was a young teenager that I came back to the U.S. and discovered oh God, I'm going to give away my age here, in the mid-1970s that I began to even hear this word and begin to understand what it meant. Because overseas, this kind of identity politics doesn't exist, right? It's becoming more and more prevalent because of migration, but overall it didn't exist. So this is, coming back to California was a way that I began to understand identity politics.
Yeah.
And I came into anthropology specifically to understand Mexicano identity because of that kind of crisis in my own youth, so to speak. So I left the private sector, I left corporate banking, and went into academia, went into anthropology specifically to study identity.
Well, then it sounds like I came to the right place.
Okay, well, I'll do my best.
Yeah, actually, so I think we'll circle back to some of that in a little bit, though, because I think some of the things you say about power in particular are themes that we are talking about in the class as they intersect with psychology. So I want to circle back to that in a little bit, but I'll open with kind of a more broad question.
Okay.
Specifically, given your expertise, if you can help us understand how the Aztecs, in particular, played a role in the identity of Mexican Americans in the United States. I know it's a really broad sort of opener, but what can you tell us about that?
It is, but and I think it's really important right now because I think the kind of discrimination and racism that Mexican Americans, Latinxes in general, were experiencing at the time that there was this embracing of the Aztec culture is being repeated right now. So you kind of see these kinds of trends in identity politics, right? And so Chicanismo, for the most part, had begun to die down. It wasn't as necessary, as prevalent. We have all kinds of new migrants from Latin America here now who don't necessarily have the same kind of history. So it was, I think, balanced out, but now you're seeing a resurgence, and it's because we have a resurgence in that kind of racism and discrimination. So the formation of it, for the most part, was truly about identity politics. It was about the Brown Power movement and the recognition that there was an unexamined kind of racism that occurred in the American Southwest against people of Mexican, in particular, descent. So the Brown Power movement came together. The Brown Power movement had a Puerto Rican movement that was happening on the East Coast, and then you had the Brown Power movement here on the West Coast. So they kind of came together, primarily through the U.S. government, actually, because in response to the demands from Puerto Ricans and in response to the demands for folks on the West Coast, this notion of Hispanic was created. But in any event, the Aztec Empire provided evidence of validity. It provided evidence of power. It provided evidence that we came from a brilliant culture. And the kind of discrimination we were facing now is the same kind of thing that the Spanish invasion had for the Aztecs. And so the embracing of it is really about embracing the beauty and the power of the Aztecs.
Is it safe to say that it was a really effective counter-narrative to the experience
Absolutely.
That they were?
That's exactly
that
what
brown
it was.
people were having at the time?
Absolutely it was. They're Catholic for the most part during this era, right? So they carry those kinds of values in a country that's very Protestant based, so there was a conflict in the way in which we understood family. and the way in which we didn't embrace individualism, that familialism was prevalent. So the Aztec Empire became a way in which we could stand proud again, in a way in which we couldn't find in our own history at the time.
Okay, so that speaks to the power dynamic you're trying to. It was a very political and conscious attempt at reclaiming power.
And it isn't just power against others, it's self-empowerment.
Self-empowerment.
It's a way in which I could look in the mirror and no matter how thick my accent was, no matter how brown my skin was, no matter how black my hair was, I could look in the mirror and say, but you come from this amazing background.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that had been kind of stripped away, being an immigrant or being a migrant, from many generations at that time.
So that's really fascinating to me. In some sense, it begs the question, why the Aztecs? So
Right.
if you think about Mexico and what it covers and who the peoples are, why did Mexicanos, why did the Mexican Americans sort of latch on to the Aztecs in particular? Why not Mayans? Why not other groups?
Because the Aztec Empire is probably the only group that doesn't have an origin story that is situated in growing up from the land. So the Aztecs, the Mexica of that time period, have a narrative, right, about coming from its land, about coming from someplace else and having migrated and having been lost and having been basically a mobile kind of group that didn't have a very firm place. And then the eagle, the snake, the cactus, all of that gives them location, gives them place, right? So I think for migrants, people whose family histories come from that, this was a group that, you know, that's who we are, you know, we moved, and this is where we should be. And of course, the notion that Aztlan actually begins in the Californians, in the Colorado kind of area and moves down is an important part of that narrative.
Yeah.
And it is true, and a lot of people don't realize this, that there is DNA evidence of the same groups in Colorado. The Cupeño here in San Diego carry DNA evidence of having a heritage to the Mexica, to the current contemporary Nahua people.
Okay. Is there also some significance to the tie to an indigenous people,
of course,
as well?
Of course. I mean, there's this whole discussion about whitening, right? There's this whole discussion about, you know, this idea that you are that much better because you're güero, you know, because you're güera. It's something that, you know, that I've had to deal with because I am a güera, right? And my father's from Jalisco, and my mother is of German descent. So, you know, I'm the Frida Kahlo moment, only I'm the Frida Kahlo moment that came out being güera, no? So I think that the tie to the indigenous identity, though, is about location. It's about grounding ourselves again and saying we are pueblos originarios, we are First Peoples.
Okay.
And so don't tell us we don't belong here.
Well, so that brings up another thing I wanted to kind of explore a little bit. I'm wondering what's important in terms of the symbolic meaning of Mexica, Aztecs, and the value systems for understanding Chicano identity.
And you know, this has changed over time.
Okay.
So let me just come out and say that. I think for a lot of people, they see the appropriation of the Aztec culture within Chicanismo as somehow or another warrior based. And this is, I think, something that I'm trying really hard to get people to really unpack and understand. That the Aztec Empire wasn't about an Aztec people. It was about an empire.
Okay.
They were Mexica people. And so they had amazing poets. And women were well integrated into the education system and into literature and into, you know, we don't know enough about the warrior to know whether or not women were integrated into that. But we're still, you know, looking through that. We learn more, right, every time archaeology moves a little bit further. But there are ways in which that empire was inclusive of many other indigenous groups as well. And that's something that we need, I think, to grab onto and to better understand.